Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Mosaic Podcast. Today's guest is someone who really intrigues me. You know, throughout life, you meet certain people, and often we meet the same type of people because it's the way we silo ourselves. We put ourselves in like minded communities. And I, for one, love to go outside of my silo. In fact, I like to tear down the silo because I don't believe, as good as like minded communities are, I think they've served their purpose. And now what's happening within those like-minded communities is the distance between silos is getting wider and deeper. And really what's showing up is that we don't know each other. We don't talk to each other anymore. We stay very isolated. One of the reasons why I'm excited about having my guest on today is he's an expert storyteller, and you'll hear in our conversation together the way he spins a story and the way he tells a story. And he really tells stories around events that are truthful. He tells stories that actually happened, and he works with businesses and shows how the story of another business might help them in their own business, something that they might not think of before. And so let me just tell you a little bit about who he is, and instead of me telling you what he does, I'm going to, have we're going to get in dialogue. Paul's one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling and one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers from the year 2018. He's the best-selling author of several books, including Lead with a Story, The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, and a 20-year former executive at Procter & Gamble. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Time, Forbes, and Fast Company, among others. And he can be found at www.leadwithastory.com. It's my honor to welcome Paul Andrew Smith to the podcast. Paul, how are you today?
Hey, very good, Danny. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. We to be completely transparent, we knew each other not at all as of about 3 days ago, right?
Yeah, true.
And we had a nice conversation where we met each other. And even in the green room, just right now before we came on, we had also a really, in setting an intention for the podcast, I saw how we approach the world somewhat differently. And so I would really like, normally I start out in a totally different way, but I'd really like to just jump into that and,
Yeah,
and,
sure.
and see where we go, okay? Because
Yeah.
the goal of this podcast is not to be like any other you've ever heard. It's to sort of address ideas and concepts and different perceptions in the ways we see the world. So one of the things that I said to Paul in the green room was, let's set an intention that people can see how powerful their stories are, and also see how powerful their stories keep them where they are. And Paul, I'm gonna let you, rather than capsulize what you said, I'm gonna ask you to tell the people back what your response to that was.
Yeah, well, I think I was responding to something else that you had said there, which sounded, I'll have to paraphrase now, but sounded something like, let's hope that people will learn that they can use their stories to, remake their world, or to reimagine themselves in the world. And you said it much more eloquently than I just did.
Probably not.
But and I think my response was something like, that's great. I'm happy with people using stories for that purpose. That's just not what I do. That's not what I don't teach people how to tell stories to basically delude themselves into thinking that, their life worked out differently than it did, or
Right.
I hear, and I know people in my circle who do this, and they do it really well. They'll help people retell their own life stories over and over and over again, and changing it each time until the point that they're happy with it, until they feel good about themselves, and they feel, successful in life and happier. And they're basically being taught to master your own life story. Don't let society or the world or history dictate your life story. You take control of it, and define yourself through your own narrative about your life. And I think that's beautiful, but that, to me, that sounds like the kind of thing a psychologist should help you walk through. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not
Right.
going to pretend to help people, fictionalize their life in a way that they're happier with. I teach people how to tell, stories about things that actually happened to further usually their business objectives. Now I have a whole arm of what I do that's more personal stories for parenting, for parents to teach their kids life lessons and character traits and things like that. But then again, it really is more about really what did happen and what lessons did I learn from it, as opposed to introspection and reimagining your own life.
Fabulous. And I love that. Can we dive into that a little bit? I'd love to unfold that a little bit for people and for myself, because this is fascinating. Have you ever heard of Viktor Frankl?
Yeah, I have.
Tell me more. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was in the Nazi concentration camps and suffered through what, was probably, I guess there are worse things in the world, but I can't imagine. I can't off the top of my mind think of one or two of them right now.
Might be.
Right.
Yeah.
And he wrote after he was released that the most joyful, blissful moments he ever had were in those Nazi concentration camps. And when people said to him, "How in the world can you say that?" His answer was, "The things that happen to us are just things that happen to us. The stories we create are the meanings that we give the things that happen to us." So I would never in a million years want someone to repurpose their story to floss over all of the difficulties. Really what I was talking about is this idea that is very central in the work that I do with people, which is our thoughts become our words tell our stories, and our stories create our life. I would like to just lob that over and see what you think about that.
Yeah, I think there again, that sounds like the kind of work a psychologist might, or a counselor, or somebody might, or maybe you, is good at helping people think through.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not knocking that work. I think it's wonderful.
I understand. No, I get it.
There have been times in my life where I needed that, but I didn't turn to me to do that. I turned to a professional. So yeah, that's just not the kind of use I personally put stories to and teach people to put stories to. So I wouldn't be much help in helping you understand how to do that.
Let's dive into then what is the work that you do and the purpose that you bring to the stories you tell. Why do you tell the stories you tell?
Yeah. So what I do is teach other people how to use the art and the science of storytelling to accomplish whatever their objectives are.
Right.
So if their objective is, like I mentioned earlier, to teach their kids better character traits, then I want to teach them how to identify and craft and then deliver stories in a way that will teach the lessons to their kids that they want them to learn. At work, it would be to teach a leader or a salesperson or a marketer or an engineer or something how to tell stories to be more effective in their job, to communicate more effectively. So at work, for people at work, I think what I help people do is communicate more effectively, specifically through the art and the science of storytelling, as opposed to just teaching people how to be more succinct with their words. I mean, I do some work on that as well, but the storytelling part of my work is not about just being more clear or succinct. I don't call that storytelling. I call that, I don't know, speaking or
right.
It's something, but it's not storytelling. Storytelling is an art form. It's not really a science. I say the art and the science of storytelling, and I think the science might just be the psychology behind why it works, but it really is an art that I'm trying to teach people when I'm talking storytelling.
So I love this, and you're the perfect person for me to talk to on this. And I so appreciate you letting me sort of push the envelope here with you, because I think I'm a smart guy, but sometimes I just don't get it. And
Oh, welcome to the club. Yeah.
thank you. And as I listen to you in the art of the story, like I'm not seeing where the psychologist differentiates from the parent who's teaching values to their kid.
Mm.
I don't see where the psychologist differentiates from the salesperson who is down on himself for being, neglect for getting no's all the time, and the story just
Mhm.
invites him and inspires him to see the world a little bit differently. And can you make that chasm a little bit wider for me
Yeah.
so that I actually see it? Because I feel like what you're saying and what I'm saying are not that different. It's just different words and a different maybe approach and maybe a different bias towards
Mhm.
the way we tell it, or a different meaning that we give in Viktor Frankl's words. Like
Yeah.
the meaning that we give to that is, oh, well, that's what a psychologist does, or that's what a
Yeah.
storyteller does. But I don't really see the difference. The
Yeah.
effectiveness of a story is what?
Well, let me try and answer your first question
Please.
to widen that chasm. There are definitely stories that people can tell themselves to help, like you said, the salesperson to motivate themselves for the next sales call, or take the stress out of the next sales call. In fact, those are two specific types of stories that I teach my salespeople to tell. There's not stories they tell the buyer or their boss. It's a story they tell themselves.
Right.
So one is to motivate themselves, and one is to relax and take the stress out of the sales call. But I'll admit, though, those are pretty different than most of the other types of stories that I would teach a salesperson to tell. There's like 25 different types of stories I teach salespeople to tell, and two of them are stories they tell themselves, and they're exactly what you just said.
Okay.
The other 23 are stories they would tell their prospects, and they're things like a story about the quintessential problem that their product or service solves, or a story to illustrate the difference between them and their competitors, right? Or a story, a customer success story, showing what happened last time somebody bought what I'm selling, to show you, generally what happens. So they're more matter of fact stories about things that happened to illustrate the point that you're trying to make, better than just going through the list of features and benefits of your product. It's to
Got it.
show
100%.
them through a story the problems that my product solves, how my product works, how it's different than competitors. So most of the stories are like that kind of a story. They're not, a psychological self-evaluation that's going to help make you
Right.
feel better about the next 20 minutes of your day. Although, like I said, that's a legitimate use.
Right.
And two of the 25 are stories like that.
So
Um,
let me jump in on that if you don't mind, because
yeah.
and again, I so appreciate your patience with me,
Mhm.
because I get all that. Uh, and I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to lob this across the net,
Okay.
that every story we tell has a purpose to help
Mhm.
people see what they see differently.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think so.
And so when we see what, like, to me, all of psychology, all of that other world is about looking at the world we see and changing the perspective of the way we see it.
Mhm.
Whether that's applied to a marriage, whether that's applied to raising children, whether that's applied to a sales guy getting his strength up, whether that's applied to showing how a product can be perceived in the world differently than it was perceived, all of it, the beauty of story is that it allows us to question what we actually believe, and for a brief moment see it differently. And
Mhm.
if we like what we see, ride that story and use that story to communicate more effectively. Am I with you, or like have you go, this guy's like a new age mambo jumbo guy who's using this psychology and he wants to just hug a tree in California?
Uh, well, those are your words, not mine.
I
But
know, no, I'm
yeah,
just
yeah.
trying to make it,
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate the offer to borrow those words. No, I think if you define the word story broad enough, it can mean all of those things you just said. In fact, I have clients who, they basically use the word story to define anything that they say that they think is lovely. you know,
Yeah.
and my response to them is, you know, uh, storytelling is something. The way I use it is very specific. It just like not every set of words constitutes poetry,
Absolutely.
right? Okay. So just because you said something in a conversation that worked or that you liked doesn't make it a story
Right.
any more than
100%.
something, a memo that you wrote at work. If you liked it, it was poetry. Well,
Right.
no, that's not what poetry has, some specific criteria, rhyming and meter and other things. And, and a story does too. And to me, there's a time, a place, there's a main character. That main character is facing some kind of a problem or an opportunity. There's usually someone or something getting in the way, a villain, if you will. There are events that transpire along the way and resolve themselves nicely in the end in either a success or a failure. I mean, when I say a story, that's what I mean,
You're
as
sort of
opposed
talking
to,
about the hero's journey.
I wouldn't call it the hero's journey, and we can
Okay.
talk about different story structures. I recommend against using the hero's journey
Okay.
story
Sounded like that's
structure.
what you were saying. So I was.
Well, yeah. So, ask me about that next, because that's an interesting
Okay.
conversation about the different story structures that you can use and which ones work and which ones don't. And for the kind of stories I tell, that one doesn't work. Let me close out on the answer to your last question, which is, the stuff about psychology that we just talked about that to me doesn't feel like storytelling is that a psychologist, I think a good psychologist asks you the patient, more questions than they do talk.
Yes.
They're mostly good listeners and ask
Yes.
the right questions to get you to kind of solve your own problem,
Yeah.
right? Whereas when I teach people to do storytelling, I'm teaching them to talk. I'm teaching them to say certain things in a certain order that will convey some meaning that they want to convey. I'm not teaching them to be good listeners and ask probing questions and get the buyer to solve their own problem or get their subordinates to magically come to their own conclusions about what vision they need to set. No, I'm teaching them, no, if you want to set a vision, I'm going to teach you how to tell a story to set that vision. So it's about communicating, not listening or asking questions to get people to answer them. So that's what I see as the difference between a psychological exercise that would get you to reimagine your own stories differently, like Viktor Frankl maybe was doing, as opposed to what I do, which is teach people. No, I'm going to teach you about the hook and the context and the challenge and the conflict and the resolution of a story that you're going to craft and tell other people to accomplish your communication objective.
Okay.
Does that help you see the difference the way I mean it?
Yes, I think so. And there's still this nagging little thought in my head process that says, I'm intrigued by something you said, and we'll get back to and if we don't get back to it, I don't care about about the hero's journey.
The hero's journey. Yeah, we should at some point.
Well, I would like to get back to that, but really what intrigues me more, and it may just be that it's the type of temperament that I have and the type of temperament that you have and the type of temperaments that other people have are equally valuable, right?
Oh,
That,
of course.
that I believe most of the problems that exist in the world today come as a result of people talking but not listening.
Yeah, fair enough.
And what I would wonder, because you're such a good storyteller, like I've heard anybody who has not heard of Paul Andrew Smith before, Google him. Go to Paul Andrew Smith talks and just listen to a few of his talks. This man is a great storyteller. Okay? I don't believe you can be my belief. I want you to smash it out of the park if it doesn't work, okay? You have to be a fabulous listener to be able to tell a story as effectively as you tell the story.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You need to listen really well. As long as you're telling stories that you've heard from other people, certainly you need to be a good listener, or you won't hear enough of the story in order to relay it very well. If you're telling stories about things that happened to you, I'm not sure you necessarily need to be a great listener in order to craft that into a good story and then tell it to other people. But when you're using stories in conversations, definitely you need to be a good listener. In fact, part of what I teach salespeople is how do you get your buyer to tell you stories as opposed to just answer questions? Because if you don't listen to their stories first, how are you going to know which of your stories to tell? And
Bam.
so there are techniques that you can use to elicit stories as opposed to eliciting short answers. So I teach them some of those techniques to get people to tell stories.
I was a major part of a publishing house. And during the time that I was there, I was the director of business development. I partnered with the man who was the president. We were really running the company together. I was the face of the company, believe it or not. My face looked not as shaggy as it did now. And he was really the brains. He was scared to go out of his office, and I loved breaking down doors that didn't exist, or finding my ways into rooms that had no entry. One of the things that I realized is that just about everybody who wrote a book for us wrote the book they most needed to read. And we were a self-help company. Okay, so let me put that caveat on it. But I think it's probably true in business as well. They didn't write the book that they knew the most about, even though they were knowledgeable about it. But so many times I found myself giving counsel to some of these people that were changing millions of people's lives by just saying, you know what? I think you should read your book again, because you say it so beautifully in that. So it led me to a belief system about the world that the things that we do are for other people, but they're also for ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I was one of those authors that did exactly that. My first book, I wrote the book that I wish I could have read. And that's why I wrote it, because I literally read 40 or 50 books on the art and science of storytelling, specifically in business.
Yeah.
And I still didn't know how to do it. And that
Yeah.
just really frustrated me. And that's why I ended up writing that first book. So it was very much a selfish personal learning journey that turned into an idea for a book for other people to read.
So without getting too psychological, because you're leaning into my direction now, I'm okay with you coming over, but maintaining your space. What stories do you tell yourself now that may or may not be true? Are there any?
Oh, well, I'm sure if I expand my definition of story to meet yours, in other
But
words,
let's keep it in your definition, which are factual things that have happened that you see in a certain way. Like let's tell a story. There's an accident that happens on 2nd and Main in the middle of a downtown area of a city. There are people all around. There are people on every corner watching the accident. There are people in buildings that just happen to hear the screech and come to their window and see it. There are people that are blocks away that only heard the noise of it. There are people in towers that look down upon it. There's a helicopter that's going over that actually, let's just say for a moment, that everybody saw it. Would any of those stories be exactly the same, even though the exact same thing happened?
No, of course not. Now they'll all
Okay.
have their own perspective on what happened. In fact,
So
well,
go ahead. No, you go. Go ahead.
I can give you a real world example of that, because something like that happened to me.
Fabulous.
So my first day of my junior year of high school, so 35 years ago, I guess.
I would have guessed it was only a few years ago, my friend.
Well, thank you. But and I remember it very clearly because it was it was fourth bell, world history class. Mr. Jim Owens was the teacher, and you know how the first day of every high school class is, right? It's the administrative stuff the teacher's got to go through with you, like here's what the class is about, and here's the book we're going to use, and here's how the grades are going to work, and two midterms and one final and 3 term papers or whatever, all that stuff. And during that first 5 minutes, the back door to the room came slamming open really loudly. 3 guys came running into the room wearing ski masks, carrying guns, ran to the front of the room, knocked the teacher to the ground, pointed the gun at him, stole his wallet, took to this day what I believe is the grade book off of his desk, and then they left, all in 15 seconds, right? Nobody got hurt. But that honestly happened my first day of the 11th grade. Now, the teacher gets up, assures us that he's okay. And he says, okay, everyone relax. That was staged.
Wow.
Those are my seniors from last year.
Wow.
All right. Now, your first homework assignment is to get out a piece of paper and a pencil and write down everything that just happened with as much detail as possible. Go.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we're all still just like freaking out, right? Because this just happened. But this is long before the days of Columbine, so that it wasn't, as scary as it might be today.
Right.
But anyway, he gave us a few minutes to do the homework, and he walked around and collected every sheet of paper. He went up to the front of the room, Danny, and he read every single page, every single word of every single page to us. 5 minutes into class, 3 guys burst into the back of the room carrying guns, knocked the teacher down, stole his wallet, and left. 7 minutes into class, 2 guys and 1 girl burst into the back of the room, knocked the teacher down, stole his grade book, said some dirty words, and left. Okay. 10 minutes into class, 4 guys came into the back of the room carrying fake weapons. They looked like water pistols, spray painted black, didn't fool anybody. Next, whatever. Fooled me. Now, he read the last one, and he put the paper down on his desk, and he said, history will always be remembered through the eyes of the people who write it down. Right. So the victors in war tend to remember things differently than the vanquished. And people in political power tend to remember things differently from those not in power. So keep that in mind as we read this particular book on world history. Now open your books and turn to chapter 1. So literally, that was my first day. And I'm convinced that I learned, the biggest lesson that first day about how to learn history, meaning if I really want to know what happened in history, I might want to get more than one person's opinion. Because, if 25 17-year-olds can't remember accurately what happened 30 seconds ago, I mean, how on earth are historians going to be sure about what happened 100 years ago?
Yeah. And I love that. And thank you for sharing that. So now, are you old enough to remember overhead projectors? I get a lot of slack.
Oh, yeah. With the oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, put on the overhead projector a plastic sheet that talks about the stories that you tell people in business.
Mm-hmm.
Now put on a plastic sheet the story that you just told me about what happened in your history class.
Mm-hmm.
And put on that the stories of doctors and psychologists, the stories that they tell. And put on top of that the stories that businesses tell you tell businesses to help them not just talk about values and benefits, but to give personal meaning to some of the stories that what their business does. What sort of overlap is there?
Well, that's a pretty busy slide by now.
That is a busy slide. That is a busy slide.
Well, I mean, like you said, depending on your definition of story, those are all different stories. And some of those I professionally traffic in, and some I dabble in as a human being like the rest of us. So I just,
But I guess what I'm asking really, so forget about the overhead projector, because I didn't ask a very good question. I apologize for that. Where does perspective come into the reality of the stories you tell? And how does a change of perspective change the reality of the stories you tell?
Well, I mean, we all only have our own perspective. I mean,
Bingo.
And that is our reality. I mean, all those kids that wrote down what happened in those 30 seconds, as far as they're concerned, that is exactly what happened.
Totally. And it is what happened. For them, that is what happened.
For them, yeah. Now, if there was a video camera in the room, you could figure out whose story was closer to being true to the objective facts. But absent that, that was their reality.
So here's what I'm really like a tenacious little dog trying to, that's holding on to the pant, the cuff of your pant here.
Yeah.
Because I really want to get this place, because I think it's so central. And maybe it's not, but for me, it just makes interesting discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
There are people in the self-help movement that say, when we change the way we see the world we see changes.
Mm-hmm.
I believe a lot of what you do and the stories that you tell shows a perspective that people haven't seen before that allows them to see the world differently.
Clearly.
What does a doctor or psychologist do, if not exactly that same thing on a more personal level?
Well, like I said, I think a psychologist doesn't you don't walk into a psychologist's office, sit down and listen to them tell you stories. You walk in and sit down and they ask you questions and you answer them.
So
So they're
let me
not
modify.
telling you stories,
Let
right?
me
You're
modify that.
telling them stories.
What they are telling you is to have a look at the story you're telling, because even though you're telling people stories, when you tell people stories, the
Mm-hmm.
story they hear is going to be slightly different than the one that you tell them anyway.
Yeah,
Right?
sure.
So really all anybody's doing, like this is where I'm trying to get at. A psychologist, if he's good, will ask you to tell your story, but will help you to shape that story to what might be a new perspective of that story. So whether he's speaking or you're speaking, or it really doesn't matter. What's important is that we get a different view of the story that's there, or we get a different way of seeing the world. Like, why is the story you tell so important that it comes from you versus that it comes from them, if the perspective changes in the way that a business would want its perspective to change? There would be arguments that I might pose if we were working together and I had a business, which would be, you know what, you are such a good storyteller. I would like you to listen to the stories my people are telling and help them craft their stories better. And I bet you do that sometimes.
I do. And so, yeah, I think you've worn me down. So if you're wanting me to just agree
No,
that,
I don't
yeah,
want you to
all
agree.
these stories are kind of the same thing, there definitely are similarities between these. I just, the only distinction
Tell me.
that I was trying to make, because I thought you wanted me to make this distinction,
100%. I want
is
you to
that
stay true to yourself.
I'm not the psychologist that's going to go in and ask you a bunch of questions using the Socratic method until you happen upon a story that works. What I do for a living is a little bit more explicit. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you the parts of a story, and I'm going to help you, craft that story yourself, as opposed to, whatever it is that a psychologist does. But yes, I would definitely agree that there are similarities between all of these things.
Okay. In your own personal life, can you think of one story that you had about yourself that you believed wholeheartedly and then you found out it wasn't true?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And, again, I'm not sure I would have called it a story at the time. I guess I'll tell you about it now and it'll become a story.
Okay.
But, yeah, so when I was probably in my late 30s, my father had come to visit me, and we were in the basement playing ping pong. And my oldest son at the time was 7 or 8 years old. And I was, trying to get some advice from my dad about what to do with my son, because I said, he's tried several different sports, and he just, he'll try for like a day, and then he won't get it, and he'll get frustrated and he'll give up and he'll never want to play it again. And we'd been through baseball and football and basketball and soccer and but he just wouldn't. He was such a perfectionist, and if he couldn't master it almost immediately, he would get frustrated and give up. And I said, was I like that as a kid? Like, because if I was, I want to know what he did about it, because I didn't turn out that way. And he thought about that and he said, no, you were never really that way. He said, for example, you played baseball for all those years, 12, 13, 14 years, but you were never really very good at it. and I probably ruined my own story, because I should have prefaced it by saying I thought I was the world's greatest baseball player my whole
Right.
life.
Right.
It was my favorite sport, the one I thought I was, the best, had most capability in. It's how I kind of defined my young manhood, and my athletic prowess came to me through my participation in baseball. And here my dad tells me 20 years later that I was really never very good at it. And I guess so to answer your question, yes, that I'd had the story running around in my head for over 20 years that I was a pretty decent baseball player. And I felt really good about that. And then my dad told me I never was. And I probably spent a day or so moping around about that. And then I realized, and here's me retelling my story. um, I just thought, how awesome of my mom and dad to like come to all my little league games and cheer me on and tell me I was awesome all the time, knowing I really wasn't very good.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
I never knew that I wasn't very good
Yeah.
because they never told me I wasn't any good.
Yeah.
Right. So, and if
Totally.
I hadn't asked that question at 38, I still would think that I was a great baseball player. So,
So how do you tell the story of your baseball experience now?
well, I usually don't. I usually tell that story I tell you because,
Okay.
uh, if I tell them how, I was the star second baseman of the state championship baseball team, my little league year, which is true. If I also tell them I was a crappy baseball player, that doesn't help the story much.
So time out for a minute because I love that
Okay.
because now you just filled in a little piece of data that we didn't have
Mm-hmm.
before, right? Which was you were the second baseman, whether you were the star or not.
Mm-hmm.
You were the second baseman on a state championship baseball little league team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Here's something that people do all the time. They take their stories that they believe and they go to someone they respect who tells them a different story, and they end up changing their story, or they end
Mm-hmm.
up not believing the story that they believed all their life.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't have been a crappy baseball player to be on set to be second base, be a starting second baseman
Yeah, fair enough.
on a state championship team.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might not have been that your dad thought you were as good as you could have been, but how many times in business does someone believe something about themselves and then someone tells them you're not that, but they are the second baseman on a state championship team, and they have to have they certainly in nobody else's definition outside of their immediate family or friends or people who have agendas or some sort. I'm not saying your dad had an agenda, but close relationships have something. So normally, would ever believe somebody who told them they were crappy, but yet it happens all the time. It's the power of a story. It's the power of changing a story, of having that story pulled out from under your legs. In the work that I do, and I'm not a psychologist, although I went to school for psychology, I do coach people, and I do help people. I hold space for people to actually see their story in a real way, in a different way, not in any realer or less. Every way we see ourselves is real, but I believe there's other ways to see ourselves than the real way we see our story. Those moments where that happened, that moment that just happened for you, I would actually like to ask you rather than say what I think happened. That moment where I just said to you, hold it, you didn't say that when you told the story about your dad saying you were crappy and all the time they came to your thing, and that you didn't say that you were a state champion. What changed for you when I said, hold it, you couldn't be that crappy, but you're the starting second baseman on a state championship team. Did something change in your
Yeah, you reframed for me that you're right. I couldn't have been that bad because
yeah.
exactly we won. I was the starting second baseman and we won. So uh, yes, and so I appreciate that. Am I going to have to send you money now for that
Yeah.
little? Did that cost me?
No, it didn't cost you anything.
Okay, all
But
right.
it sort of blends I think what I'm trying to get at. It's sort of a great way of showing the power of individual stories. When I grew up, my dad passed away when I was 13. And so in order to deal with living in a random world, I made up what I think is a story. I certainly told it to all my friends. I told it over and over and over again. The story was I was going away to camp in a few days, and my dad was leaving on a business trip before that evening. And he came into my room and he said, "Danny, I'm going to say goodbye to you now. I'm going to say I love you. I will see you at parents' visitation day." And I said, "What are you talking about, Dad? What time are you leaving?" He said, "Well, I'm leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning." And I said, "Well, I'll wake up and see you. I want to give you a hug. I want to just see you. I want to see you walk out the door, and I want to just be there, and I'll wake up." And he said, "Well, just in the event that you don't, I want to say goodbye. I want to say goodbye, and I want to say I love you, and I'll see you, parents' visitation day." The next morning, I didn't wake up at 4 in the morning. I overslept. He passed away 4 weeks later, making love to my mom. he died of a heart attack. If you would walk on the street and ask 1,000 people, did the fact that I didn't wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning 4 weeks prior have anything to do with him having a heart attack, making love to my mom, and dying that moment? I would venture to tell you 1,000 out of 1,000 people would say there's no connection to that. But the only person that was important in this story was me. And I made up a story because I couldn't bear living in a random world where the person that I loved the most got taken from me for no reason that I could feel. So I made up the story that I was responsible. Those are real stories. Those stories have ramifications. Those stories affect the way we live our life and how we let people come in, and closeness. For me, it certainly did. And I get that it isn't what you would say at a business conference, mm-hmm. but I'd love to get your take on
that. Yeah, I think people do that all the time. In fact, we haven't talked about him yet, but the gentleman I wrote my most recent book about, Kenny Tedford,
yeah,
the deaf man, he, without giving away too much of the book, he was actually abused as a child by a stranger. And after the event occurred, the man told him, if you tell your parents about this, I will kill them.
Yes.
Not I'll kill you, I will kill your parents. And both of his parents died within the next 6 months when he was an 8-year-old child. Obviously had nothing to do with that. But in his mind, he never told his parents.
Yeah.
But he thought the guy must have thought that he had told his parents and killed them. So for much of his adolescence, he thought he was directly responsible for the death of his parents. And that was just haunted him for years.
Yeah.
So I can imagine.
Yeah. So I'm tenacious, I guess. I'm sorry for coming back to it, but it's just wandering in my head. How could those stories that we tell ourselves not affect the way we show up in our businesses?
Well, of course they do.
Right? So even though we tell effective stories, because the stories you tell don't limit you, you're not limited by other belief systems in that particular case that make those stories not come across. You can tell those stories because you know them now. You've told them a certain amount of times. You're probably good. You're good enough, from what I heard, at saying the same story 1,000 times as if it was the first time you ever said it. And you're comfortable with those stories. There's 25 of them and you've got them. But to someone who is not comfortable in themselves, for someone who's riddled by stories of their dad saying to them, you were never really a good baseball player, and that stealing them of the moment of being the starting second baseman for the state championship team, why wouldn't you work on the people with those stories, in the sense that affects their confidence in delivering the stories that you tell in the work that they do in their workplace?
It's just because I don't feel qualified to do that. Gotcha. Somebody like you who studied psychology might be qualified to do that. I'm not, and I don't want to have people try and pay me money for something I'm not qualified to do. But if they need help telling a leadership story or a business story or a marketing story or a sales story, I'm your guy. But I'm just not a psychologist, and I'm not going to pretend to be a personal counselor like that.
I got you.
Although I totally agree, though, that is a productive and valid use of storytelling and story eliciting and listening and all of that. It's just not my forte.
I understand. What scares you most about the work you do?
That it will go away, which was not a fear I had 6 weeks ago. So like literally, Danny, in 6 weeks ago, I was just finishing up my best year ever, today, because of the coronavirus, COVID pandemic and all that, literally every single speaking engagement that I have for the rest of the year has been canceled or postponed or something. And book sales are down 90%. Wow. 90%. And I thought, well, people won't have anything to do but sit around in the house and read, so they'll be reading a lot of books. And it's not true. They're all scared to spend any money at all because They don't know where the next paycheck's coming from. So, yeah, so my big fear right now is just in the sustainability of the business that I happen to be in, of being an author and a speaker. So I'm trying to retool my entire business offering right now to be able to be delivered virtually, like you and I
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
talking.
Is your book on audio?
So I think 3 of my books are on audio, and all of them are on, ebooks as
Okay.
well as print versions.
Um, so again, I'm, a tree hugger from California. Okay.
Mm.
All right. So understand the context of the story that
Yeah.
I'm telling. I believe the most powerful stories come from the adversity, and maybe we can go hero's journey here, not hero's journey.
Mm.
Maybe this is my lead into that. Okay. But I believe the most powerful stories come when people are at the top of their game and then something happens completely out of their control. And everything that they had was now metamorphosized into something that is no longer there. And the recreation of the person, the recreation of the product, the recreation of the story, the recreation of the format of that makes the greatest story ever told. You're a great storyteller. What if I'm going to say my definition of it, not yours,
Mm.
because I completely respect that you don't want to be seen as a psychologist and coach people in an area you don't feel comfortable coaching people in. But what if that was a limiting belief that you had? What if the power of the stories you tell are more powerful than your knowledge of a topic or not? But your expertise isn't in your ability to be a psychologist, because nobody has to be a psychologist. It's in your ability to craft a story to allow people to
Mm.
see even who they are and what they do differently, because that's what you need to do right now. None of the
Yeah. Well,
25, none of the 25 stories that you have
mm.
learned are helping you in this situation right now.
Right. So,
Right?
yeah, if things don't get back to normal soon, Danny, I may be doing exactly that. I'll put my psychology shingle out, and I'll I'll just ask people the same kind of questions I do when I'm interviewing them for a book, and I'll get them to share their whole life story and solve their own problems. So yeah, maybe that'll be my next step. Who knows?
It would just be an interesting, like the fact that you're sitting with a tenacious little slug like me, who won't let you off the hook on this for some
Yeah.
reason, right? Which is stupid,
Yeah.
because you have your work, right? I don't want.
Yeah.
My goal isn't to
Yeah.
change anything. But
Yeah. We'll see.
in the process of researching your story, you are doing exactly what the psychologist is doing. You're asking
Mm-hmm.
people questions about eliciting their story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, and so maybe someday, but I would imagine state licensing boards might, frown on me trying to enter the
But you could be a coach.
psychology business. Yeah,
Coaches are not psychologists,
yeah,
but they
and
still.
I do some of that. It's
I'm
just,
sure you
yeah,
do.
I'm typically not coaching people, on those kind of really intimate, personal, type things. I'm coaching people on, look, I got this business problem. Can you help me think through it? I've got this communication issue. Not, look, my dad told me I wasn't a good baseball player, and now I don't have the confidence to go for this
Right.
next job. Can you,
Right.
help? That's just not what I do.
Um, what's been the biggest surprise in the work you did?
Maybe that it worked. I mean, um, yeah, when I wrote that first book, I mean, like I told you, it was really started out as just my own little selfish personal learning journey, because I was frustrated that I didn't know how to tell stories at work. And I think, that first book is now in its 11th or 12th printing, and it's in 7 or 8 languages around the world. And, that was not what I expected to happen. I'm glad that it did, but that, I didn't assume that I'd write a book and it'd be a, fabulous, successful bestseller or something. And that was surprising and fortuitous, and certainly paved the way for an entirely new career path for me, which I'm very grateful for. But yeah, it was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah. When you look out your window at the world you see, it could be post COVID-19, pre COVID-19, in COVID-19, but really the environment of the world you see around you. Is this the world you always dreamed you'd hand over to your kids?
Oh, well, yeah. Nobody wants to hand their kids a world that's in, pandemic, but I don't imagine this will last long. The world has seen much worse, health problems and diseases come and go in the past, and it will again in the future. And I imagine we'll move
How
past
about
this.
the world that was pre-COVID-19? Is that the world you
Oh,
would hand over to your kids?
uh, for the most part, I'd say, yeah, I think I'm kind of a fan of, I think it might be is it Daniel Pink's work where, he looks back at across much of history at basically how good was life for human beings. And while today it's very en vogue and expected and somewhat chic to complain about how lousy the world is, and there's greed and there's whatever debauchery, and people don't have values anymore. And I kind of wish for back in the 1950s Ozzie and Harriet days, or what, the people, and there's crime. And so, but according to Daniel Pink, I think, and I think the evidence supports this, we're generally living in one of the best times that humans have ever known. I mean, a couple of millennia ago, a third of all adult men, at least, could expect to die in battle with the neighboring tribes, with clubs or whatever. And, and another third, of men and women would die of disease, and women would, frequently die in childbirth. And I mean, just the world was red in tooth and claw, as I think Tennyson said, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a nasty life was, what is it? Nasty, brutish, and short. you know,
Yeah.
uh, the world is a wonderful, beautiful place today. I mean, I can't imagine growing up any other time. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen the invention of the internet and the landing of a man on the moon, and like, holy cow, what a wonderful time to be alive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would feel fine. I feel fine. My kids growing up in today's world where they have modern dentistry. I mean, it's
Uh,
fabulous.
so for people who don't see the world that way, because
Hmm.
I ask that question to end every podcast,
Hmm.
and more and more people are starting to say yes. But in the beginning, I would say about 97% of the people said absolutely not.
Hmm.
And maybe it's in the way I ask it, or something changed in me, or I'm having different people.
Hmm.
But to the world of people who don't see the world the way you see it, is there one thing you could suggest to them that they could start doing today that would help them lean into the beauty of the world that we live in right now?
Yeah, read more history books. I think that's the easiest way to generate some appreciation for the amazing opulence and that we have today. Um, yeah, if you think the world today is just this awful place, I mean, you're jaded and short-sighted, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
or maybe you've grown up in a really bad place or bad situation, and that certainly happens. I mean, it would be hard to tell a starving child in the middle of the African Serengeti that life is beautiful, and why are they, suffering? Well, I'm not callous towards people who are in a worse place, but to the majority of the, first world, there's not a lot really to complain about, I
Yeah.
think. So look around you more, read some history, look at other places in the world, and you'll very, very quickly realize how privileged you are.
Love that. Paul, how can people get in touch with you if they want to? Not if they want, because I'm sure they're going to want to
Hmm.
know more about what you do and the work you do. And how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, thank you. Just my website that you mentioned earlier is probably the easiest way. So it's leadwithastory.com, and there's probably all my books are there, and the training courses I teach and things like that are all there. And you can connect with me through email somewhere on that site, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we will list all of that in the show notes, so that you don't have to remember it. You just check the show notes and we'll see it.
Hmm.
I want to say what a pleasure it was, and normally I take about a minute or two to summarize. Is that okay if I summarize?
Yeah, please do.
Um, I think the conversations I enjoy most are conversations that challenge the way I see the world, and today Paul did that for me. Um, Maybe I was too tenacious. Maybe I just held on to something. Maybe I tried to push a point. I hope not. I hope that wasn't what I was perceived as doing. As a, I guess my constant view of the world is on the outside of things, everything looks different. And the more we dive down deeper into this, into what it really is, at the core of what it is, everything's pretty much the same. And so I like to take a look at values and beliefs and thoughts and stories. My definition of story is certainly not Paul's, because he has a more traditional definition of story, perhaps. Um, at the stories we tell, and at the core of those stories, what is really real and what is the purpose of all of that? I believe that the stories we tell create the life that we live. It doesn't mean that we change the life that we live. It means that just like that accident happens on that street corner, just like that teacher brought in 4 seniors, the
Or was it
reality,
three?
3 seniors. I think it was 3. I see.
Well,
I'm already changing the
who
story.
knows?
I'm
That's
already changing the story. But the teacher that brought in the 3 students, and that everybody had a different take on what that story is, that somehow there's beauty in seeing all the perspectives, because all the perspectives have truth to them, at least to somebody. And there's also beauty to seeing the camera version that we couldn't see in that story of the teacher bringing in the 3 or 4 students. Now, if I say it 4 enough, maybe you'll believe it was 4. Right now, it's easy.
I'll tell it that way next time.
You'll tell. Right? Uh, and what happens to us when we actually have the courage to put aside the story that we tell for a moment and allow other perspectives to tell their story? What would our world look like? How would our businesses change? The beauty of what Paul does, I believe, is he repeats stories of things that have actually happened to people who don't know those stories. And it changes the way a company or a business presents the way they present themselves. The power of story. If it can happen with a business, it can certainly happen with an individual. It can happen with a community. It can happen with a nation. So what are the stories you're telling? As you listen to our discussion really means nothing if it hasn't inspired you to take a look at what does story mean to you. I want to thank you again, Paul, for coming. You're a good man for letting me, sit on this one spot and just dive down deep. Uh, and I thank you, the listening audience, for coming again and listening to the podcast. Please, if you like it, give it some stars. If you like it only 1 star, give it 1 star. If you like it 5 stars, give it 5 stars. I'm not asking you to do anything other than what you do, but just say what you do. And if you feel to, write something about it in Apple Podcasts. Please check out the work that Paul's done. Please Google his name, hear the way his stories tell, and especially in this time when people are not showing up to big conferences. See what your business can do by having Paul come and address them from a computer screen to a computer screen. His stories impact the lives of people and change the way businesses do business. Take advantage of it. Thank you again for coming here. I honor you. I respect you. I love you for being a part of this. We'll see you next podcast.